The destroyer's evolution from simple convoy escort to highly specialized submarine hunter reached its peak between 1943 and 1945, when the Allied navies faced a Japanese submarine force adapting rapidly to new American sonar and air cover superiority. At the beginning of the war, most destroyer commanders still relied on tactics inherited from the interwar manuals: maintain zigzag patterns, drop depth charges in broad patterns, and avoid excessive pursuit that might expose the screen. By mid-war, after painful losses in the Solomons and along the Philippine sea lanes, this changed completely. Experience taught that a submarine, once forced to dive deep, could often be trapped through patience and coordination rather than brute expenditure of explosives. Crews learned to vary speed deliberately to confuse the enemy's hydrophones, to alternate short bursts of high-power sonar pings with silent runs that listen for cavitation bubbles from a submarine's propellers, and to exploit thermal layers, those invisible underwater temperature boundaries that bent sound waves and could hide or reveal a vessel. Destroyers began practicing what wartime manuals called echo-ranging attacks, in which the attacking ship would calculate the target's probable course and intentionally place the explosive pattern slightly ahead of it, much like a hunter leading a moving bird. This technique demanded nerves of steel. A delay of even 3 seconds between contact report and weapon release could mean the difference between a kill and a wasted run. The Japanese response was ingenious. Submarine captains began using knuckle turns, sudden bursts of rudder that created turbulent wakes confusing to Allied sonar, and released decoys, small noisemakers known as bold, German, or improvised acoustic jammers, that mimic propeller sounds. In turn, destroyers installed better hydrophones and improved sonar processing gear, allowing operators to distinguish decoy patterns from real machinery noises. But beyond electronics, it was the crew coordination that defined survival. Each destroyer's combat information center became a miniature brain, sonar data fed to plotting boards, rangefinders cross-checked with radar sweeps, voice tubes linking the bridge, engine room, and depth charge racks. The psychological load on these teams was enormous. Hours of monotonous searching could explode into 20 seconds of action when a contact appeared. The order, contact bearing 095, range 800 yards, prepare for attack, would transform an apparently calm ship into a machine of pure precision. Men at the K-guns and racks armed the depth charges, the helmsman adjusted trim, engine telegraphs went full ahead. The destroyer itself became the spear. The "turning into torpedoes" phrase popular in post-war memoirs captured that unity of purpose: hull, machinery, and crew aimed directly at a single submerged adversary. One of the best demonstrations of this torpedo mindset occurred during the legendary USS England, DE 635, campaign of May 1944. In less than 2 weeks, this small destroyer escort sank 6 Japanese submarines, an achievement unmatched in naval history. England's crew operated within a hunter-killer group assigned to protect the approach routes to the Solomon Islands. Her success stemmed not from luck but from the flawless orchestration of sensors, weapons, and decision-making speed. When sonar operators reported a faint echo southeast of Bougainville, the command team immediately shifted from convoy escort routine to attack posture. Within seconds the ship's power settings changed, depth charge patterns were readied, and the Hedgehog launchers armed. Captain Walton B. Pendleton relied on precise sonar bearings rather than the older method of estimated track. His ship would surge forward at 15 to 20 knots directly toward the predicted submarine course, fire a spread of forward-thrown contact bombs, then roll through the target's wake ready for follow-up depth charges if necessary. This tactic mirrored the ballistic commitment of a torpedo run. Once the approach began, there was no turning back without losing contact. The Hedgehog's contact-fused bombs would only detonate on impact, so a successful strike produced a series of sharp explosions, confirming a kill. A miss left eerie silence. England's sonar team maintained composure through dozens of attacks, adapting to each opponent's countermaneuvers. Japanese commanders attempted to dive beneath the thermal layer or turn sharply to break contact, but the destroyer's persistent, data-driven pursuit meant every evasion merely reset the calculation for another lethal approach. The USS Nicholas, USS Fletcher, and other destroyers operating in the Solomons refined the doctrine further. They learned to execute step-down attacks, alternating between full-speed closing runs and slower, controlled reacquisition passes. This reduced the risk of losing sonar contact and maximized explosive density around the submarine's likely position. By late 1944, Allied destroyers integrated radar, sonar, and direction-finding data into a single tactical picture. The Combat Information Center acted almost like the guidance computer of a missile. Inputs were processed in real time, outputting precise helm orders and engine telegraph commands. Crews trained to respond without hesitation, their synchronization turned the entire vessel into a living weapon, every man's motion contributing to trajectory and impact. Reports from the Battle of the Philippine Sea described destroyer divisions weaving through torpedo wakes and exploding oil slicks, charging towards sonar blips that might or might not represent a submarine. Such determination mirrored the mentality of kamikaze pilots, but inverted in purpose. These men risked themselves to neutralize suicide attacks rather than conduct them. The ship's narrow hull, tearing through spray at 30 knots, produced shock waves that interfered with enemy periscopes and acoustic homing devices. Sailors later said the vessel felt alive, angry. In truth, it was disciplined aggression shaped by relentless drills and technological innovation. As the war advanced into 1945, Japanese submarine tactics degraded under constant air patrol pressure, yet the destroyers' aggressiveness never waned. Even when enemy subs attempted ambush shots from coastal shallows, Allied captains closed to point-blank ranges, firing depth charges set for minimal delay. The resulting underwater detonations often damaged the attacking destroyer's own hull plating, but crews accepted that price as part of their role. Each engagement reinforced the transformation of destroyer warfare from cautious defense to calculated offense. The destroyer's very identity, fast, lightly armored, dependent on teamwork, made the metaphor of turning into a torpedo profoundly apparent. To dodge or destroy the Japanese submarine threat, these ships had to embody the qualities of the weapon they feared most: speed, accuracy, and unwavering direction. During the crucible of the Pacific War, the metaphor of a destroyer crew turning into torpedoes crystallized from a mixture of doctrine, technology, desperation, and hard-earned seamanship. It was not a literal transformation but a behavioral and tactical one, where the small, agile warship and her team abandoned measured hesitancy and embraced the kinetic, single-minded characteristics of the very weapon they often carried. To understand why that happened requires examining the operational context, escort duty, anti-submarine warfare, ASW, and the shifting nature of submarine threats, as well as the instruments, procedures, and psychology that shaped decisions under fire. Destroyers were designed for speed, maneuverability, and flexible armament, guns for surface action, depth charges and later ahead-throwing weapons for subsurface threats, and torpedo tubes for ship-to-ship combat. Tasked with protecting convoys, larger capital ships, and supply lines, destroyer captains had to reconcile two competing imperatives: keep the convoy steady and avoid panic-driven, reflexive maneuvers that exposed the escorted vessels, while at the same time neutralizing an underwater predator that could sink a transport or carrier with a single successful attack. Japanese submarines, ranging from fleet boats to long-range submarines, posed a particularly vexing challenge. Early war limitations in Japanese doctrine meant that many IJN submarines focused on scouting or occasional fleet attacks rather than sustained commerce raiding, but the skill of individual crews and the geography of the Pacific still produced lethal encounters. American and Allied destroyer doctrine evolved quickly in response. The goal was not simply to detect submarines but to force them into exposure and then hit them rapidly and decisively before they could escape into thermal layers, undersea topography, or the dark of night. Technology drove tactics. Sonar, ASTIC in earlier British naming, provided the contact, radar and radio direction finding helped narrow search areas, and the development of forward-firing weapons, for example, the Hedgehog and later patterns of contact-fused projectiles, allowed an attacking destroyer to maintain sonar contact while engaging the target, a critical advance because traditional depth charge attacks required the ship to pass over the contact and lose sound coherence, giving skilled submarine captains a small window to evade. With these tools came a new psychology of attack. A destroyer on the offensive could no longer loiter at a cautious distance and trade cautious rounds of depth charges. To succeed it often had to make a high-speed, low-profile approach, trimming speed and helm only at the last instant to place its pattern where the sub was predicted to be. In operational terms this produced what contemporaries described metaphorically as torpedo runs, by the escorts, fast, direct, and with a single aim, to close to effective range and let flown patterns. Or a salvo of ahead-thrown charges land with maximum density. This approach required coordination among lookouts, sonar operators, the bridge, and the weapons crews that had to lay charges, set fuses, and time deliveries in a matter of seconds. The human cost of that doctrine was not trivial. A high-speed attack towards the last known position of a submarine was inherently dangerous. If the contact was a false echo, the ship could be exposing itself unnecessarily to counterattack from the surface or from concealed submarines. If the sonar contact was accurate but the approach miscalculated by seconds, the destroyer might pass over a shocked but not destroyed submarine, losing contact and giving the enemy an opportunity to escape under a thermocline. Yet doctrine and experience taught that the longer a hunter delayed, the more likely a submarine would slip away. The men in the forward astic/wheelhouse became, in effect, the guidance for a human torpedo. The quartermaster keyed the helm to a bearing that would bring the ship's bow and weapons to intersect the submarine's track. The sonar operator, hunched over primitive cathode ray tubes and headphones, called out range and bearing updates in clipped cadence. The captain made a binary, consequential decision to commit. The destroyer's engines bellowed as the ship surged, and every crew station moved from routine watchfulness to concentrated action. Depth charge crews manned release mechanisms, Hedgehog crews rammed projectiles into firing positions, and damage control teams readied for the shock and spray of an explosive pattern. Such attacks were rehearsed and drilled, but nothing truly duplicates the tightrope of judgment under real contact. The convert-to-torpedo mindset also emerged from the broader operational art of offensive escort, a shift from purely defensive screening to proactive hunting. Allied convoy doctrine by mid-war increasingly favored aggressive local counterattacks, using the escort network's speed and numbers to encircle probable contacts, apply overlapping sonar coverage, and force a submerged enemy into a kill box. Destroyers would often coordinate with corvettes, frigates, and aircraft, carrier-based Avengers or Catalinas, to compress the submarine's escape routes, but when aircraft were absent, the destroyer alone had to act. In those moments the crew's discipline and the ship's systems had to operate as if the destroyer itself were the torpedo, unambiguous in course, relentless in pursuit, and designed to deliver a lethal, concentrated punch through careful prediction and brute force placement of explosives. Finally, there was the psychological vector. Submarines were invisible killers, and crews who had seen the mounting wreckage of torpedoed merchantmen developed a grim resolve. The sight of a burning transport or the news of a convoy crippled spurred a moral clarity. Hesitation now equaled liability. Destroyer crews, officers and enlisted men alike, internalized that clarity, and their training emphasized rapid, decisive action. The torpedo metaphor therefore captured not only a tactical form, a straight, committed attack aimed at a single point, but also a moral orientation. Destroyer teams accepted risk to protect the larger formation, to deny the submarine the anonymity that had cost so many lives. That mix of technology, doctrine, rehearsed procedure, and moral urgency explains why destroyer crews often shed cautious escort posture and executed attacks with the concentrated, self-sacrificing intent of a torpedo run to dodge, neutralize, or drive off Japanese submarines threatening their charges. Behind every burst of sonar pings, every roaring engine order, and every depth charge detonation, there lived a human rhythm, a blend of fear, discipline, and pride that shaped the destroyer's crew into a single conscious weapon. For sailors aboard destroyers in the Pacific, the daily tension of unseen threat cultivated a mindset that psychologists later compared to that of fighter pilots, alert, reactive, and constantly tuned to invisible danger. When reports of submarine sightings circulated through the fleet, most men did not picture an adversary but rather a shadow beneath the waves capable of ending hundreds of lives without warning. The submarine was faceless, and this anonymity made it both terrifying and motivating. It became not just an enemy ship but a symbol of all the unseen dangers of the ocean. The destroyer crews responded by internalizing aggression. They resolved never to wait passively for attack, but to become hunters themselves. In post-action reports, captains often described their crews as wired like torpedoes, their adrenaline focused on one vector: find, close, and destroy. Training reinforced this mindset. In American and British naval schools, recruits underwent sound discipline drills, learning to identify the faintest mechanical resonance or cavitation signature in static-filled headphones. They practiced attack sequences repeatedly, transforming abstract sonar data into mental images of an unseen battlefield. When orders came to make ready for attack, there was no pause for doubt. The routine took over, and muscle memory replaced fear. These exercises conditioned crews to act faster than instinct, like the guidance systems of the torpedoes they launched. The naval academies and training bases along the U.S. West Coast produced thousands of sailors whose confidence rested not in physical superiority but in the trust that every man in the chain would perform flawlessly. Engineers maintained pressure valves and gyrocompasses, signalmen ensured communications between ships, deck crews readied charges and weapon fuses. Each person's small contribution aligned toward one decisive moment, the instant of attack. When these men later wrote memoirs, they often described the feeling of total immersion. We were no longer individuals, the ship was alive, and we were its heartbeat. But the emotional toll was immense. Continuous anti-submarine warfare, ASW, patrols meant long stretches of monotony punctuated by seconds of pure terror. Many sailors developed what medical officers called depth charge fatigue, a combination of sleep deprivation and auditory shock from repetitive blasts. Even when the explosions were their own, the concussive forces reverberated through the hull, numbing hands, ears, and judgment. Some veterans recalled losing hearing temporarily after prolonged hunts, yet refusing to leave their sonar posts. The psychological paradox deepened. To survive, they had to behave like the very weapons that endangered them: single-minded, explosive, and expendable. This self-identification with the machinery of destruction was not madness, it was adaptation. In the confined, vibrating steel corridors of a destroyer under combat conditions, the line between man and machine blurred. Commands were relayed through sound-powered phones, echoing down metal tubes, the pulse of engines mixed with the thud of boots on decks. In that environment, a destroyer's crew could indeed turn into torpedoes, not by transformation but by perfect synchronization with the lethal purpose of their vessel. Japanese submariners noticed this change in their enemies' behavior. Intercepted diary fragments from captured crews described American destroyers as, unlike earlier ones, they come too fast, they do not hesitate. What Japanese officers called recklessness was actually the product of careful doctrine, the realization that aggression itself was a form of defense. The faster a destroyer closed the range, the less time a submarine had to align torpedo tubes and fire. Naval tacticians termed this reduction of engagement latency, a sterile phrase that in practice meant throwing one's ship into danger before the enemy could act. Allied intelligence officers even mapped how destroyer divisions coordinated these high-speed attacks, creating interlocking patterns of pursuit. The result was psychological dominance. Submarine captains, once confident that depth and silence guaranteed safety, began to feel hunted. Their decision cycles shortened, their evasion patterns grew erratic, and the balance of initiative shifted to the surface ships. After the war, historians analyzing the Pacific Campaign noted that destroyer effectiveness stemmed as much from morale and psychology as from hardware. The men who fought in those lean, gray hulls carried scars, physical and emotional, but also a unique pride. They had survived a form of combat that demanded total unity between human will and machine precision. Veterans' reunions in the 1950s and 1960s often featured a common refrain: "We were the Navy's torpedoes, fast, straight, and deadly when aimed right." Their phrase was not bravado, it encapsulated an ethos forged in steel, saltwater, and fear. When World War II ended, the destroyer's duel with the submarine left a doctrine that reshaped every navy on Earth. The Allies' experience proved that speed, coordination, and information were as decisive as armor or firepower. The phrase, turning into torpedoes, gradually entered the vocabulary of post-war tacticians, not as poetry but as a principle. A destroyer that hesitates is a destroyer that dies. The U.S. Navy's post-war analyses, compiled in the classified Anti-Submarine Warfare Evaluation Group reports, broke down every successful attack to trace the human-machine interface that had allowed crews to behave with the unity of a guided weapon. Those findings led to the redesign of bridge layouts, sonar operator stations, and combat information centers so that a single voice command could translate instantly into a firing solution. In effect, the ship's architecture itself became a memory of the wartime mentality. As the Cold War dawned, Soviet submarine production skyrocketed, reviving the threat that the Japanese and Germans had once posed. The new diesel-electric boats could dive deeper and run quieter than their wartime predecessors, and soon nuclear propulsion extended their endurance from hours to months. The destroyer, too, evolved, sprouting radar domes, variable-depth sonars, rocket-launched torpedoes, and homing missiles. Yet beneath the electronics the spirit of the old destroyer men persisted. Training films shown at U.S. Navy schools in the 1950s featured footage of World War II hunts, narrated with the admonition that the torpedo never questions its orders. Recruits were taught to trust automated systems but to keep the aggressor's instinct alive, the willingness to close the distance and press the attack. When the first ASROC, anti-submarine rocket, entered service, it was described in internal bulletins as extending the destroyer's body, a direct echo of the wartime metaphor of men becoming extensions of their weapon. NATO's joint ASW exercises through the 1960s and 1970s preserved the same choreography. Frigates and destroyers hunted in coordinated, barrier patrols, each unit acting as a sensor node in a vast torpedo-shaped formation stretching across the North Atlantic. Commanders spoke of vectoring our strike, language lifted from torpedo guidance theory. The idea was psychological as well as strategic. By adopting the mindset of a weapon, fast, direct, unrelenting, surface fleets could impose constant pressure on enemy submarines, denying them initiative. Even as computers took over plotting and sonar analysis, captains reminded crews that machines were only as decisive as the people behind them. The torpedo image endured because it symbolized purpose stripped of hesitation. By the late 20th century, advanced passive sonar arrays and helicopter-borne torpedoes changed tactics again. The destroyer no longer had to race headlong into depth charge range, yet training manuals still emphasized the offensive spirit. In interviews, Cold War veterans admitted that this culture traced straight back to the Pacific hunts. One captain of a Spruance-class destroyer put it simply, "Our fathers chased submarines with their own lives on the line. We chase echoes, but we keep their nerve." The metaphor had become heritage. Museums that later restored wartime destroyers, like USS Kidd and USS The Sullivans, found that visitors were fascinated not by the weapons themselves but by the stories of men who fused with their ships, acting as guided extensions of national will. Modern anti-submarine warfare, with its drones, autonomous undersea vehicles, and AI-linked sonar nets, seems far removed from the days of sweating crews in steel compartments. Yet the continuity is unmistakable. The logic of the torpedo still governs the doctrine: rapid detection, instantaneous decision, straight-line execution. Naval officers studying contemporary engagements, from the Falklands to the South China Sea, note that success still depends on what wartime destroyer captains called attack nerve, the ability to commit without second-guessing. In this way, the destroyer crews of World War II left more than a record of victories, they left a cognitive template for how modern navies think about combat under pressure. Their transformation into torpedoes was never about physical change, it was about human beings aligning perfectly with the mechanical rhythm of their ships, turning fear into forward motion. From the Solomon Islands to today's digital oceans, that spirit endures in every sonar ping and every helmsman's decisive turn toward contact, the living inheritance of men who once became their own weapons.